So good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Masira webinar on the Australian Universities Cohort Draft Report. My name is Luke Harris, and I am a Media Officer with the Media Centre for Education Research Australia. Before we do begin, in the spirit of reconciliation, Masira does acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia and their connections to the land, sea, and community. For myself, that's the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and that we do pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, this meeting will be recorded, as I've said just previously, and will be available to our Masira subscribers. I acknowledge that there might be some of you here today that aren't subscribers or from our subscriber partners, which we do welcome, of course. And if this is you, and if you'd like to know a bit more about Masira and what we do have our General Manager, Bindi Taylor, who can answer a couple of the questions directly. We also have our Media Officer, Brendan Deppermore, present, who will be moderating this webinar and will be able to assist with some questions. So yesterday, the Federal Education Minister, Jason Clare, introduced the interim report on the Australian Universities Accord during a speech at the National Press Club of Australia. In that speech, he introduced a number of recommendations, including 5 immediate priority actions to address change in the current university learning system. Masira, alongside the New South Wales Council of Deans of Education, as well as the University of Newcastle, have put together this webinar to help journalists and policymakers better understand the contents of the report, as well as to answer any burning questions you might have about the report. Our first guest speaker this morning is Professor Barney Dalgarno from the University of Canberra. Barney is the Executive Dean of the Faculty Education at the University of Canberra and an executive member of the Australian Council of Deans of Education. His research has international impact in areas including the future of higher education and the learning affordances and educational impact of digital technologies. He's authored over 100 publications and received national recognition and awards for his higher education learning, online innovation, leadership, and editorialship of journals. Barney will be speaking on topics such as funding models, VET and higher education, research quality and equity, with a primary focus on the first of these 3 immediate recommendations that were outlined in the report. Following Barney, we have Associate Professor Jess Harris from the University of Newcastle. Jess is an Associate Professor in the School of Education at the University of Newcastle, and she's worked in research on leadership and change and across 3 education systems in Australia, as well as many others internationally. Jess's research is focused on the professional development of the teachers in regional remote areas and the casualisation of higher education. Jess will be speaking on the final 2, primarily on the final 2 of these immediate recommendations, focusing on employment conditions and the casualisation of Australian universities, as well as the funding for public institutions. Each of these speakers will have about 8 or 10 minutes of speaking time, followed by a Q&A at the end of the webinar. If you'd like to ask anything during the webinar, please post any questions you might have in the chat, either during or after speeches, and we'll basically collate them and ask them in a bit of a Q&A at the end. So without further ado, Barney, I invite you to the stage. Barney, I will just quickly ask you to unmute, please.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Luke. Look, yesterday I had the opportunity to attend the press club luncheon where Minister Clare spoke about the report. So I'll say a few things about the things that he said in his presentation, as well as some of the key elements of the report. The report includes 5 recommendations for priority action, all of which were explicitly supported by the Minister in his presentation for immediate implementation. And also, the report also contains about 70 additional ideas which are, I guess, being put out for further debate prior to the release of the final report at the end of the year. So Minister Clare really signalled what he personally values as Education Minister when he devoted the first 15 minutes of his 30-minute speech to a recount of some of his experiences growing up in Western Sydney, passionate statements about the value of early childhood, school and university education in addressing inequality, and data showing how far we still need to come in addressing some of that inequality. He also talked a lot about what he's done or what his government has already done outside of the university sector in working towards addressing some of those issues, and really kind of noted the need to address the issues across early childhood, school and university education in order to address those issues holistically. In fact, he hardly mentioned the Accord or universities until about halfway through his speech. Now, there were 5 recommended priority actions in the interim report. The first 3 were really clearly aligned with that equity agenda. The first was to extend visible local access to tertiary education by creating regional university centres or hubs in not just regional areas as they're currently located, but also suburban and metropolitan locations, and doubling the number of these hubs from 34 to 68. I think noteworthy here is the way Minister Clare mentioned the invisibility of higher education in Western Sydney when he was growing up. And I think in some respects, the visibility of these hubs in areas that don't contain a university campus may be as important to Minister Clare as their actual function. The second priority action was reversing the decision to cut off funding for students who fail more than half their units in a year of study. And Minister Clare was able to give examples of the number of students impacted by this at Western Sydney University and also nationally. And he really talked passionately about the way this policy introduced by the previous government tends to affect students from disadvantaged and underrepresented groups much more than more privileged students. I really agree with the notion of instead supporting these kinds of students to be successful rather than, I guess, booting them out after a year of unsuccessful study. And certainly over my many years in academia, I've seen a number of students like this who have failed most of their units in the first year, but then through support have been able to change their approach to study and also address some of the life challenges that they've experienced. And I've seen students like that not just limp their way to graduation, but actually end up with credit and distinction averages. And so under this policy, we wouldn't see those students completing university. The third priority recommendation was ensuring that First Nations students are eligible for a funded place at university. And essentially what this means is that Commonwealth funding of places allocated to First Nations students will no longer be included within the university's capped funding. Now, I understand that already this is the case for regional and remote First Nations students, but this change will actually extend that to metropolitan First Nations students as well. I think noteworthy here is that Minister Clare alluded to the idea of extending this kind of arrangement to other underrepresented groups, such as students from low SES backgrounds and other students from regional and remote backgrounds. And I think it really makes complete sense. If the government is really serious about broadening representation from these groups within universities, then the obvious thing to do is to essentially provide demand-driven funding uncapped for those kinds of students. So it'd be really interesting to see how that falls in the final report. The other 2 priority actions were slightly less predictable in that they didn't align so explicitly with the equity agenda. The first was providing funding certainty through the extension of the higher education continuity guarantee into 2024 and 2025. The higher education guarantee is essentially introduced during COVID in order to ensure that if universities saw a significant drop in student enrolments, they would still receive the Commonwealth part of those students' funding up to their cap. Essentially, Minister Clare said that he didn't want to see universities falling off the funding cliff while waiting for the full set of changes from this review to be implemented. But interestingly, consistent with the broader equity agenda, universities not meeting their caps, that additional funding taking them up to that capped level will now have to be spent on initiatives supporting the participation or success of equity students rather than just moving the funds into consolidated revenue. The 5th priority recommendation was engaging with state and territory governments through National Cabinet and with universities to improve university governance, particularly focusing on universities improving their employment practices, staff and student safety, and the idea of doing that through ensuring the additional involvement on university councils of people with higher education expertise. I found this one a little bit surprising because it's not really clear to me that increasing the number of members of council that have higher education leadership expertise will necessarily lead to universities improving their employment practices, such as underpayment of casuals, or improve student and staff safety. It'll also be pretty hard to implement this one because universities, apart from the ANU, are all established under state legislation, and that legislation differs hugely across the country in terms of the parameters around the employment of councils. So in addition to those 5 recommendations, there were around about 70 other ideas put out in the report for consideration, covering a very wide range of policy areas. Some are quite specific changes consistent with Minister Clare's equity focus, which probably could be implemented without fundamental changes to the organisational funding of the higher education system. However, the report alludes to some much more broad-reaching changes, which, depending on the government's appetite, could really challenge some of the ways of doing things that haven't really been touched by governments for many years. And just a taste of those, some of those are around potentially rethinking the HECS help system and university funding models towards a more equitable, needs-based model. And he mentioned the notion of the fact that funding for private schools, for example, is much more focused on needs-based rather than a universally for all students. The second one, establishing a tertiary education commission with responsibility for negotiating mission-based compacts with universities, as well as setting student fees and Commonwealth contribution amounts, will be a big change if implemented. Bringing the organisation and funding of VET and TAFE and higher education sectors closer together to enable perhaps innovative stackable programs combining learning across both sectors. That will be a big change because at the moment VET is really sort of led out of states. And then finally moving towards national competitive grants such as ARC grants, covering the full cost of research, whereas at the moment academic salaries are explicitly excluded from those grants. And what we see at the moment, of course, is that universities have to fund the academic salaries components of research out of funds that are kind of more explicitly directed at teaching. So the idea of fully funding competitive grants could really change that kind of landscape.
Lovely.
So that's a bit of a summary for me, and happy now to hand back to Luke and then Jess.
Lovely. No, thank you for that, Barney. Thanks for that your presentation on that one. Just as a reminder, if anyone does have any questions for Barney, please feel free to put them in the chat box below, and we'll have a look at asking them at the end of the webinar. But without further ado, Jess, I'll invite you to the stage now, and you can have a chat about what you've prepared for on the Accord.
Thanks so much, Luke. Thank you, Barney, for going through those 5 priorities that Minister Clare spoke about yesterday. And as Barney said, there was not a lot of detail about the Accord other than those 5 priorities. And one of the noticeable absences when I was watching, I wasn't actually able to be there as Barney was, but when I was watching the press club address, there was very limited mention of academics and those who work at universities and the role that they play. And I applaud the Accord panel and Professor O'Kane on this focus on equity and bringing higher numbers of students into higher education. And the research from the University of Newcastle that my colleagues and I have done some of show that students from all walks of life aspire to higher education. And I think that this Accord will sort of bring in some of those changes that can remove the barriers that are currently in place for getting students from all areas into university. But it is all interrelated with the idea of funding and staffing of universities. Having more young people coming in to get university degrees is so closely interlinked with those ideas of funding and staffing, because we want to ensure the quality of their experience while they're in university, not just providing them with access. I really want to put my voice here to the call for some further consideration about funding models and employment practices that haven't been included in the detailed priorities that Minister Clare spoke about yesterday, and say that we should feel that investment in higher education is an investment for all young people and for the nation. It's not just intended to be for those who are wealthy or live in metropolitan areas. The Accord sets out a vision for 2035, which is a vision for a more equitable university system that provides really high quality education, teaching and research. And in order to achieve that accord, we need to think about the employment conditions of those who are currently working in universities. The establishment of the Tertiary Education Commission, which was announced yesterday, might go some way to building those practices of ensuring that universities are good employers, but it doesn't go all the way at this point. From 1995, we've seen a drop in government funding for universities of 0.3% of GDP, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you look at that in 2021, that was a reduction of $6.5 billion to the sector. And in order to ensure the success of this accord and of the sector, we require enduring and stable funding, and that's noted in the Accord Interim report. The proportion of casualisation and casualised employment in universities poses a really strong threat to the quality. I'm not saying that the people who are currently working as casuals in universities are not doing a great job, but when you're only employed casually, there is so much institutional knowledge, all of that expertise and skill that leaves the institution after that casual period of employment ceases. And casualisation is disproportionately affecting early career researchers, early career academics, and women. And this means that they don't get paid for professional development. They don't get paid for sick leave or any of those sorts of supports and benefits that come with ongoing employment. The Accord report notes that casualisation is not inherently bad and that some people would like to be employed casually. But a 2019 report from the NTEU showed that 82% of the people who are currently employed casually in universities are wanting more stable employment. They're being shut out from being able to access loans, mortgages. There are women who are unable to plan maternity leave because they don't have those benefits. And I've heard through my research stories of academics who are working through chemotherapy treatments and working through massive family traumas because they can't afford to go elsewhere. And this isn't just a problem for early career researchers, although they are predominantly the casual academics, but some academics have been on casual contracts for decades. And so they are just on these rolling contracts that don't allow them to have professional development, and more importantly, don't provide them time to support student learning. They are only paid for the time that they are actually spent teaching or marking the work of students. And for many of those people, they're limited in the time that they're actually able to spend marking. We've seen reports in the last few years of academics being allocated 10 minutes to mark an assignment, which doesn't give people the fundamental structures or the payment or incentives to provide great feedback and the sorts of feedback and supports that students need, particularly those students that Barney spoke about who might have struggled in their first year at university, but need some additional support to succeed. The Accord recognises that the staff underpayments are patently unacceptable in public universities, but these issues go beyond underpayment. It's just a call for universities to recognise that academics including those who are on casual contracts, need to be paid for the hours that they work, need to be supported in supporting the students who require additional help. And we're seeing at the moment what's playing out in the United Kingdom with universities not being able to award degrees to students at the end of their final years. And that seems like some sort of dystopian reality that we could be heading towards that path unless there is some consideration of more consistent and more stable funding for universities. And just to add on that tagline that they're saying in the UK, that they're using in the UK, is that staff working conditions are actually student learning conditions. So we need to think about valuing the staff in universities in order to provide that much needed support for the students.
Lovely. Well, thank you for your chat there, Jess. And yeah, absolutely, that's quite damning actually in terms of having those. I can't imagine being a student doing my 4, 5, 6 years of university only to not receive a degree at the end of it. Yeah, I think that would be quite very discerning, basically, if I was a student, especially if you're a staff member as well. We'll move into a bit of a Q&A now. And why I've got you here, Jess. So we have a question from Tom Carey, who has asked, what should the Accord final report recommend to fix casualisation in higher education?
Well, I think that these are the spiky problems that Minister Clare spoke about yesterday, that there is no simple solution. Universities are committing more and more to decasualising their workforce. But last year in some universities, it wasn't last year, sorry, 2021, in some universities, only 1% of casual academics were made permanent through that kind of conversion process. So we need to make conversion processes easier. We need to ensure that universities have the funding to be able to secure ongoing employment, because at the moment it's very much based on student levels and levels of need, whereas it's not kind of based on the need of the universities to be able to supply the supports that are required.
Another question here from Tom asks, improving access to higher education for underrepresented groups has been a target since the 1990s. Does the Accord offer new ideas for improving equity? And if you have the Accord in front of you, I'll turn your attention to, I think it's figure 2.1 set to 9, 2.1 to 7, sorry, which has some information about the participation ratio for underrepresented groups at the Table A institutions. So how does the Accord offer new ideas for improving equity for these people who are in underrepresented groups?
Well, I'm happy to go first there, just to say that Minister Clare was asked a question similar to this during the Q&A at the Press Club. And one thing he did say was that you can't address these problems by just focusing on universities. You really need to actually focus on the whole system. And he quoted figures that suggest that children's attendance of preschool is a really strong predictor to actually finishing school and starting university. So actually addressing problems across the whole ecosystem is important. I guess the other thing that I noticed that's kind of on the possible agenda for the final report that I haven't seen before is a kind of a greater recognition that the barriers to disadvantaged students attending university are just as much about cost of living as they are about how much they're going to pay through paying back their HECS help loans. I have seen also, though, that there's a perception by, sort of privileged students that, of course, they'll earn enough once they graduate to pay back their HECS, whereas a lot of students who are first in family, it just seems like a really large amount to have to pay back. So it is a bigger impediment. And one of the things that's kind of been earmarked is the notion that HECS help funding for students could be more means tested so that students who need it more could get more contribution, but also that something might be done to address the cost of living beyond just Centrelink for students from disadvantaged groups. What did you see, Jess, in addition to those things?
Well, I think in terms of the HECS help system, there was some discussion about changing the way in which it's calculated, because at the moment it is being calculated in some bizarre format that I don't want to try and explain here, but I know that for many students, when it was adjusted for CPI this year, more than half of what they had managed to pay back, even those students who had met the thresholds and were paying back, more than half had been added to their current debt. And so that's a big issue. The other issue is recognizing the diversity of students, and particularly the diversity of students in those so-called equity groups, because people don't fit into those neat little categories. There are so many, there are so many diverse issues and challenges that students face, regardless of where they live, of their cultural backgrounds, of their linguistic backgrounds. And so just targeting specific equity groups, while it can be absolutely of benefit and should be applauded, it should provide some nuance and some understanding of some of those challenges that are faced by all students.
Something that's been, I guess, on people's tip of their tongues for quite some time is the forgiveness of HECS help fees, and that has somewhat kind of happened in terms of nursing and doctor degrees, where we these are the workforce people that we actually need to be working basically, more than any. But what are your thoughts on a proposed model for, say, a forgiveness of HECS help for first time in family students? Basically, is there a model that you could propose that would be beneficial to the Australian university system?
I think that's a challenging question, and I think it has worked well. And really looking at those priority areas and the supports for students, I think that the means testing would provide some way forward for students who might be first in family, might have come from disadvantaged backgrounds, or equally might not ever be able to meet that income threshold, or might not ever meet that income threshold to pay back the HECS help, which is of concern.
Barney, did you want to add to that one at all? Or?
No, I'll let that one go because I know there's a few other questions there.
No worries. We had a question here from Luke Campbell, who asked, how does the Accord influence vocational education within the universities?
Yeah, so I'll go first there if you like. Certainly, there are some universities that are dual sector providers, and it seems to me that even universities like RMIT, for example, still quite separately focus on the vet and higher ed kind of sectors. And I feel as though the barriers to kind of a more cohesive ability for students to actually study a combination of the two in order to achieve their outcomes in the the AQF kind of really separates it out, and the funding model separated out. The fact that the Commonwealth funds higher ed but states fund the vet sector, and also the funding is very different in the way that it's allocated. One of the things in the report suggested the notion that CSP places from the Commonwealth could actually be allocated to some vet courses. There's also recommendations to implement the findings from the review of the AQF that was commissioned by the previous government, but never implemented. And I can imagine, you think about some professions such as engineering, where engineers are working closely with experienced tradespeople as part of the work that they do. And there's a lot of professions like that where there's a bit of a blurry line between what's university education and what's kind of trade education. I could see some real benefits in an electrical engineer also having some of the hands-on skills that a tradesperson has, and vice versa, so that they can really kind of work together as part of teams. And I do think the notion of kind of micro-credentials that allow people that are perhaps university qualified to do some additional postgraduate study that's more of a vet style, and vice versa, could be facilitated by some of those AQF changes.
I think that leads on to the last question in the chat, which was for Barney and works really nicely. So I'll step back here.
Lovely, thank you. Well, look, we have I think we'll end it on with that. We'll have one more question. Look, of course, this is a draft report that was announced with the full report expected to be towards the end of the year. Now, is there anything that you would like to see more of opinionated? But is there anything that you may have been missed out in this draft report that you would particularly like to see included in the full report when that doesn't get released?
Well, I think Minister Clare made it very clear that not everything will be able to be funded, that they're looking very closely at the recommendations of the report. But I would hope to see some more overarching change within the models for funding to university to support the sector, and hopefully that will support equity of participation as well as as supporting the quality of our higher education and further education.
I think there's some really important comments in the original discussion document that I think kind of make clear that the government doesn't really have an appetite for increasing drastically the total funding from Commonwealth to universities. But nevertheless, there's comments in the interim report and mentioned by Jason Clare yesterday that there's an expectation that the number of university places the country will need is going to double over the next 25 years. And so it really does feel as though there may be some perhaps unpalatable changes coming in the final report with regard to the distribution of fees from the Commonwealth versus individual students. And, so some of those kind of fundamental changes to funding models, it could be a case of be careful what you wish for.
Lovely, thank you. And there was actually one question, I'm sorry, from Kylie, who asked, Barney, can you expand on the proposed funding for stackable courses? Will all VET providers be able to participate in this model for the entry-level courses?
Well, I think, one of the things that Jason Clare said yesterday was that he would like to see equal status for VET and higher ed, seeing them as each serving a different purpose. And I think the notion of kind of stackable courses and bringing together the two is very much around giving VET providers the opportunity to provide micro-credentialed study that addresses people who are already degree qualified, but also could be counted as credit into degrees or other VET courses. So I do see a real opening up of opportunities for both VET and higher ed to actually broaden their remit.
Lovely. Well, I think that concludes our webinar today. So on behalf of Masira, as well as the New South Wales Council of Deans of Education, as well as the University of Newcastle, and our guest speakers today, Barney Delgado and Jess Harris, we do thank you all for coming and attending this webinar. Now, this webinar will be able to basically, there's a recording of the webinar, so we'll be putting that up for you to watch if you need to watch that back. And we'll be putting out some media items on this in the next, I think, in today as tomorrow as well. So, look, guys, keep an eye out for what we will be putting out soon. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming along.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.